So there's been a massive interest in today's event, which we think really shows, I suppose, like the relevance and importance of the topics we're going to be discussing. And if you're tweeting about it, we'd encourage you to use the hashtag rooting resilience. I'll throw that in the chat in a minute as well. So we've got a programme for about 2 hours, which is going to include the launch of 2 new resources we developed as part of the Working for a Better World project and a panel discussion. And we're really honoured to be joined by members of our panel today. And we'd just like to extend a very warm welcome to them. We are delighted to have Gabriella Brent from Refugee Trauma Initiative, Paula Quirk from Sparasi, Alia Abidi from Lighthouse Relief, Donna Vuma from Massey, Maddie Williamson from Free Humanitarians, Prue Waldorf from Refugee Solidarity Summit, Brendan Woodhouse, Search and Rescue Responder, and Pat Rubio Bertrand, Refugee Rescue SAR Response. And we're also delighted to be joined by musician and activist Elena Yakubi, and she's based in Lesbos in Greece, and we'll be hearing a song from her later on today. So just to give you a really quick introduction to Comhlámh, for anyone who doesn't know us, we're the Irish Association of Development Workers and Volunteers, and the name means solidarity in Irish. Our organisation was set up in 1975, so about 47 years ago, and it was founded by people who'd worked or volunteered in the Global South and who were coming back to Ireland, I suppose, with a new awareness of global injustice and inequality and of the interdependence of the world. And from the very beginning, a really important part of the organisation's work has been around supporting people after a placement in the Global South. And this has kind of taken the form of practical supports, but also very importantly, accompaniment for people in their transitions and journeys as they return to their previous lives. And they're often, I suppose, very profoundly moved and affected by what they've seen and experienced. And the return process can be at times isolating and emotional and stressful. And in recognition of this, Comhlámh developed individual and group debriefing processes, which involve non-clinical peer support interventions. So we've repeatedly heard from people who've availed of these about their usefulness and importance in their lives. And we were considering a number of years ago how best, I suppose, to support people who are involved in migrant solidarity responses within the EU. And this project, which it's called Working for a Better World, Sustaining Civic Responses to Migration, it grew out of that desire to extend the supports to civil society organisations and volunteers and faith-based networks and grassroots movements and activists and search and rescue responders and everyone else who's involved in responding to the needs of people who are seeking international protection in Europe, who are coming from increasingly difficult circumstances and making increasingly fraught and perilous journeys to get to the EU. So we're working in partnership with 3 other organisations who have a similar interest in collectively supporting and resourcing migrant solidarity responders. So our partners are ActionAid Hellas, who are based in Athens in Greece, CISIA, who are based in Palermo in Italy, and ULEX, who are based in Catalonia in Spain. And we receive funding for this project under the Erasmus Plus programme. It's been running since November 2019, and it's going to finish in March of next year. And because of the pandemic, all of us as partners have only met in person once, but we've worked online and we've been able to produce a series of resources. So there's a research paper that we launched last year, and the training manual and learning resource we're launching today, and we'll include links to where you can access these in the chat as well. We really hope that these resources are going to help to build resilient practices and cultures within organisations, and ultimately to contribute to addressing the psychosocial support needs of staff, volunteers, and everyone else who's involved in migrant solidarity responses. So just before we begin, just to give some quick acknowledgement and thanks, we're extremely grateful to Lurgas, who are the Irish National Agency for the Erasmus Plus programme, for their support and advice and encouragement at all stages of this project. And we'd particularly like to thank Denise, Siobhan, Veronica and Ronan, who've been just amazing in their partnership and support. Our sincere thanks to the organisations and groups and individuals who have supported us throughout the project. So we'd like to say particular thanks to the Crosscare Migrant Project, who is our associate partner in Ireland, to Massey, to the IRC and the MRCI, who've provided invaluable feedback at all stages of the work. And we're extremely grateful to the individuals who participated in the research and the pilot groups and who shared their very personal experiences with us. And I would just like to thank all the Comhlámh team who've contributed so much to the project at all stages of its inception and development, especially Elena, Sandra, Mark and Aga. And then finally, I'm just going to hand over to our amazing project coordinator, Quiva, who has been involved with all stages of this project from its very inception and has really built it into something much deeper and more powerful than we had originally conceptualized as being. So it's lovely to, I'm just seeing all where everyone is joining us from all around the world. It's so lovely to see you all, and we hope you enjoy it over the next 2 hours. Thanks a million. Just hand to you, Quiva.
Thank you, Derpla. Just because Mark actually is operating our slides, Mark, we might go from the cover slide just back to face to camera, and then we'll go to the quotes later, if that's okay with you. So we'll just close down the slideshow for now. Thank you. You're very welcome, everybody. I've just been reading through some of the locations, the geographies that you're all joining us from today. And as Derpla mentioned earlier, the glimpse that we've got over the past few days in terms of the really positive response to this event, for us is really indicative of the need to deepen and broaden a conversation that we know so many of you who are attending today are already involved in or hoping to participate in. And what we thought today in organizing this gathering was really for it to be a place of reflection and of a generative conversation around how we can do better vis-a-vis more integrative trauma and resilience-informed supports of people engaged in work in various different contexts. And in trying to conceptualize this project, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that we've held dissonance around it at various sort of stages and iterations over the past 2 years. And part of that dissonance came from, the very violent reality in which it's situated. It came from that witness that so many of you who are in this space today have in terms of the impacts of policies, the impacts of borders, of racialized violence at those borders that is making the journeys of refuge-seeking women, men, and children so very difficult and oftentimes painful. So in this project, as well as developing resources, some of which will give you sort of an oversight around today, we really focused on process as well. So what does reciprocal process of inviting people engaged in this work into a space of conversation, of reflection, of sharing, of vulnerability sometimes, of the intimacy that grew, the warmth that grew over the past 2 years of those conversations taking place. And again, I think I speak for the entire team when I say that we were very deeply honored by, the honesty with which people engaged with the material, with the reflections, with those moments, I think, of shame and guilt that came up within some of the conversations about that need to attend to ourselves, that need to attend to creating a collective ecology of care. And it was a process, that feels very much in its inception, a process that will continue sort of beyond the launches and, the dissemination of these resources into something hopefully more deeper and systemic. And part of our intention today, if I use the word systemic, is to really recognize, not only the wider systems that we've referred to vis-a-vis migratory journeys, refuge-seeking journeys over sea and land, but also the systems that people work within. The what was referred to, time and time again as sometimes a normalized sort of culture of burnout within NGOs and CSOs to a lesser extent. Um, and I think there was a feeling of expendability around some of that feedback, that people felt sometimes that they were committing themselves to work with heart and dedication, and that perhaps at times there wasn't enough focus on really resourcing the responders. So because a lot of what we've been trying to generate today is around witness, our focus for the event is very much on lived experience. And we went back and forth in the planning on this as to whether we would sort of call into this space just people engaged in sort of psychosocial work or psychotherapists, or researchers, etc., or whether we call into this space a combination of both. And we chose to go for the latter, obviously. And we are so privileged to have the collection of voices that we have today who can speak to, not only the journey, whether that is in search and rescue response, whether that is responding in humanitarian or solidarity response, educators, social workers, psychosocial workers, etc. But in this space, what we're really hoping more than anything is witness to what has resonated and worked for people vis-a-vis their own self-resourcing, collective resourcing, self and collective regulation, and what they hope perhaps organizations can begin to implement in terms of more robust, sustained resourcing of staff and volunteers. So towards that, we have two sort of junctures that we're just going to go through pre the panel. One in a few moments is a very beautiful song by a young woman, a human rights defender, a musician, a refuge seeker, who is a deep friend to many of us, the brilliant Elena Yakubi, who's joining us today. And part of that is to sort of set the scene in terms of the context, not only of borders and of limbo and of suffering, but also of freedom and of community and solidarity, which Elena speaks so well to and sings so beautifully to. And prior to that, we have some slides that I'll call upon Mark in a moment to give you a glimpse of. And those are a series of quotes, narrative quotes from some of the focus groups. And we chose to share these today in the sense that it gives us, I think, a glimpse of the integrity with which a lot of people engaged in both the focus groups and the online resources, but also a poignancy in the sense of maybe offering insight into profoundly, oftentimes brave and resilient people, accompanying brave and resilient communities on the move, but also to some of the gaps that exist. And I see Patty here from EI, and many others of you who are engaged, I think, with such deep creativity and really holistic attendance to a lot of this work. So it's really great to see many of your faces here. I see my beautiful mother and Cynthia and many others as well, who have been engaged in this work in so many different iterations for years, amongst them with survivors of sexual violence in various different contexts. So I'm going to go to the quotes, if that's okay, Mark. And maybe what we could do after we sort of just look at the photo, which is by Santi Palacios, just up at the top there, or if you just scroll down, which is an image that spoke to us all in the sense of reflection, just up at the top there by the sea. Or we can go down to here, but yeah, in terms of reflection and that sort of meditative space of pause. So I'll give you space just to read through a few of these quotes. And then perhaps we could go on to the next one, Mark. Thank you. And perhaps the next one, Mark. Thank you. And then the next. Thank you, Mark. And maybe we'll go back to camera now just for the next two sort of segments. So just to sort of spotlight there, two sort of lines of inquiry that we're hoping to sort of weave into the panel as well. One is, in a way, what was referred to at various different junctures in the groups, almost as the pathologization of pain. So how do we move away from a model that to many participants did feel quite medicalized and reductive into something more holistic, into something that holds space for meaning making in the face of injustice, that looks at the existential, the spiritual, that looks at identity, that looks at what we bring to this work pre the work, vis-a-vis our own attachment structures, our own lived experiences, our own ways of dealing with conflict. One that recognizes that none of us are blank slates coming into this work, but that also recognizes and honors the profound, oftentimes, resilience and courage, whether learned or vicarious, but that is a constant, oftentimes, for both people engaged in this work and, again, the communities that we accompany. So with that, we're going to go to Elena, if you're ready. Our lovely Elena Yakubi. Maybe, so Mark is going to be spotlighting panel participants after this, and Elena to begin with. So Elena, if you wouldn't mind just putting up your hand. Mark, Elena has a mural behind her on the wall. Thank you. And hi, Alia. Lovely that you could join us.
Can you see Elena there now?
Not yet. So Elena, if you wouldn't mind just putting up your hand one more time.
No, I have her spotlighted.
Not yet. Oh, we can. Okay, so Kate can. Fantastic. Great. Maybe it's just something wrong with my screen. Oh, great. Everybody can. And Lee, you're so welcome. So perhaps, Mark, if you could unmute Elena. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Elena. I live in Lesbos. I'm grateful and proud to be in your presence today. And I'm thankful that you gave me this opportunity to be with you here in this conference. Yeah, I'm gonna perform my song. Maybe you saw the video. The name of this song, My Dreams Still Fly. I hope that you can enjoy it through the online. پرنده ها در قفس اسیرند، از بالهایشان خون میچکند. مردم در خیابان ها با صدای بمب و تفنگ میرقصند. پدر عسکر بود، در کوها شهید شد. کودکان گرسنه‌اش در زیر چادر برقع مادرش ماندند. آواره شدم، زخمهایم عمیق می‌سوزد. یکی آسودم، یکی بی‌آشیانم، یکی میخندد، یکی میگرید. من بالهایم شکستم، اما آرزوهایم پرواز میکند. این شهر ویرانه چراغان خواهد شد روزی. از میان کوه بیابان‌های تاریک گذشتم، گذر کردم. از میان سیم‌های خاردار مرزها گذشتم، گذر کردم. کفشایم پر از سنگ و خاک بود. موجای دریا قایق مرا میربود، میربود. آواره شدم، زخمهایم عمیق میسوزد. یکی آسودم، یکی بی‌آشیانم، یکی میخندد، یکی میگرید. من بالهایم شکستم، اما آرزوهایم پرواز میکند. این شهر ویرانه چراغان خواهد شد روزی. while another's homeless. One is smiling while another's crying. One is floating in wealth, one is starving. We humans all should have our right, our equality, our freedom, our peace, our dignity in this world. My dreams still fly. Thank you. And existing of kind-hearted humans like you can change this world really, and by being united and harmonic and, let's say, homochromatic, we can make this world to a peaceful world. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Elena. It was such an honor and a privilege to have you in this space. And for folks who are listening, for attendees, Elena is in a process of still journeying. Her journey, as you'll see from the video and some of the links we'll send around later, began in Afghanistan and then Iran and then Turkey and now Lesbos and Greece. But she's hoping to continue that journey. So we're trying to think collectively of ways in which we can be part of that village of solidarity around her in her future studies and performance and advocacy. So we'll send some links later just in terms of practical sort of rowing in with that process and those hopes and aspirations as well later. And I just like to say, in a way, I think Elena could write a book about psychosocial resilience. So yeah, definitely far from abstract in the sense of both that lived experience and very deep wisdom along the way. So thank you so much, Elena.
From you, thanks.
Thank you. Hey, and big salams to all of our friends in Lesbos. And now we're going to go from music, which is, yeah, I think just such a space of potential in terms of a language that really just draws people in a very deep way, to a different kind of voice. But we're going to segue into our panel discussion now. Everyone is in sort of the virtual room except for the lovely Donna. So after I sort of give the opening line of inquiry, I might just be sort of on my phone to see if she's okay in terms of tech, but hopefully she'll join us soon. But in the interim, we're very pleased to have a really great panel assembled for today. I'm going to spare you all reading through your bios, because I know that can feel a little bit like a tooth extraction at times. But I think suffice to say, for everybody who's glimpsed the bios that were up on the event page, there's a really great circle of lived experience, of wisdom, of insight, and really sort of a praxis between the theory and the practice of a lot of what we're sort of gesturing towards today. So welcome all of you. What Mark is going to do, if you can put up your hands, is he's going to spotlight you into a room within the room. So folks, yeah, thank you.
That's all done.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark. So you're all very welcome. Alia, Maddie, Pat, Gabriella, Brendan, Prue, Donna soon to join us, Paula. And what I thought for attendees might be really useful and might give them insights. A lot of folks who are attending today are already involved in migrant justice, refugee solidarity, accompaniment work of undocumented communities, etc. So a lot of them are already sort of, journeying in that path. But what would be really helpful, I think, today, as I mentioned, the email, would be to hear from individually from each of you vis-a-vis sort of some of what you've witnessed in your work, maybe to locate your work for attendees. And then some of what you've witnessed perhaps vis-a-vis processes that are either resourcing or sort of depleting amongst colleagues or staff or activists or volunteers that you've worked with. So what are sort of some of the things that you've observed? And then we'll use that as sort of a pathway into maybe insights or advice in terms of maybe how we could do things better as well, how we could begin to have conversations around doing things better. So I can't see this screen, but I'm going to ask if it's okay for Gabriella to start. And I see, just by the way, one of our focus groups participants, Richard, is there with his gorgeous little baby. So you're so welcome. And thank you so much. One of Richard's, part of one of his quotes was actually included earlier today as well. But yay. So Gabriella, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you today and to see so many faces and to hear that absolutely beautiful music. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful way to start the day. So I'm here talking from perspective as a psychotherapist, and I also who works for the Refugee Trauma Initiative. And so I'm head of programs and clinical lead for RTI. I'm not going to talk, it might come into our programs. We do a range of things, which is primarily focused on training and capacity building grassroots organizations and working with refugee communities to set up non-clinical psychosocial healing spaces that support communities, displaced communities on the move. But a really big piece of what we do at RTI that we have done since the beginning is helping the helpers. So he's supporting humanitarian well-being, which is, I think, why I'm here today. And as we all know, I'm going to share a quote that we like to share from the amazing, indomitable Audre Lorde, who says that self-care is not a luxury, it's a priority, which is something that we deeply believe, but we recognize that and continuously see that self-care, but mainly organizational care and looking after the well-being of humanitarians is certainly not prioritized and has a huge impact on people providing care, like many of you in this group today, which also then has a knock-on effect on the communities that we intend to serve, which is why we all show up to do the work that we do. So I'm kind of throughout this morning session, I'm going to be referring quite a lot to a pilot that myself and some colleagues from different organizations, primarily the Human Hive, and a shout out to the brilliant Darren Abrahams and Kim Barbaji, and Sophie from Indigo Volunteers, who kind of conceived of a pilot which we've been working on, which has been I saw in one of the quotes, or a couple of the quotes, a kind of response to that often the psychosocial support available to humanitarians being from outsiders. And what we've really wanted to do as a collective is, having been the people that are outreach to when there are crises in the humanitarian sector in different contexts, and said, you know, can we offer us support groups and one-to-one, and we have done over the years. But actually what we've done is work with 12 organizations in the last year to support implementation and integration of well-being practices into organizations, so that organizations have that capacity to self-sustain and to support each other from the inside. And then we've also been looking at well-being policies in organizations, like are there the policies in place and is there the management support? Because often people in teams who are in place to support well-being are not supported by their organizations, or it's not taken seriously. So that's something that I'd like to really focus on today. I'm going to stop talking in a moment, but I think everyone else will share. There's the reason that we do this is we've seen there's in the program and the pilot, it's just reflected why we did what we did, which is the turnover of humanitarians doing this work is incredibly high, and it has a huge impact. So clearly that suggests that, and we know, right, the reasons people left is they were overwhelmed, they were unsupported, there was too much just changes in the sector, there wasn't enough sustainability in organizations, and it means that, and also people are not paid often to do this work, and so it's not sustainable to carry on. And so it has a huge impact on organizations that are really trying to support people who are incredibly difficult, some of the most difficult life circumstances, when there's a huge turnover of people, and relationships are really one of the primary things that a lot of these services are offering alongside whatever else it is, whether it's basic needs or lessons. And when there's such a high turnover, that consistency that it's so important that we try to provide isn't possible. So I'm going to hand over to the next speaker, but I will come back to these points and what I think we can do about it.
That would be brilliant, Gabriella, and we'd all really value maybe in sort of the third line of inquiry to hear, the more specifics about that work with the 12 organizations. That would be really fantastic. Thank you. I'm wondering, Alia, if your mic is working, if you'd like to contribute.
I hope it is. I really hope it is. Hello.
It is. Hi.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I've heard the music, that the song that we've listened to, like on the link, but hearing it live just has so much more meaning. So thank you again for that. It was amazing. And I think I would start maybe with some of those observations on that you were mentioning, maybe from what can deplete us, what can tire us out over a long period of time. And I think, I can only really speak from my own experiences, but I think that when I started doing kind of work alongside refugees in different countries and spaces and displaced people on the move, I didn't have any understanding of actually it was such a steep learning curve in terms of understanding lived experiences and the many injustices that come across, because it was really only by working alongside people that I began to even have any understanding of what those experiences were. And then the learning experience of how much you can action and how much you can impact, and how much you can't necessarily, definitely over a short period of time. And I think that long term, I didn't really realize how that was impacting my relationship with the world, with society, with the country that I called home. And so I think that over time, over the years, actually has had the most impact on me, if I think about it in terms of a personal individual level. And so having a more, and if I think, years back, I started in Lebanon with the Palestinian people living in camps outside Beirut. And if I think back now, it's been years since I first entered that space. And I think I don't think that I spent enough time really unpacking with people who were doing similar work, how that was changing my perspective on geopolitics, on social justice, but also on sort of what I was learning about grassroots and the actions that people are taking themselves, the resilience that they're showing, and my role in how I can sort of contribute to that space. So I think it's really in the more recent years, when I've met colleagues, a lot of who are on this call, who have actually helped me to think about some of those things, and think about them, because it opened my eyes just by hearing some of the thoughts that other people were having. it opened my eyes to actually like, oh, this is something that I think about, but I'm not really sure that it's ever been given a frame in my mind or a space in my mind. I just want to comment on something that Gabriella really mentioned as well about sort of, you know, helping helpers or even just looking after ourselves. A friend of mine who sort of decided to step away from her journalism of conflict areas in order to look after herself. And a couple of years ago, she sent me a postcard that said, "Healing is part of the revolution." And I think I've really taken that on board and really tried to remember that in some very difficult times. And so, yeah, I think maybe I'll leave it there for now. Maybe there's just one reflection that sort of comes most to mind from Lesbos. And it's going again back to what Gabriella was saying about you know, just being confronted with the hardest situations that people are in and being there, trying to be a support in those moments. It's 6 years ago, and I still think about a man that I met on the shores of Lesbos who was looking for his son and had crossed countries to look for him. And you can't, I don't think it's a number of years that will ever erase that memory from the impact that it has to be confronted with someone in such a desperate circumstance and know that there's really, I think about it because I think over the years I've thought, should I have had more training? Should I have been that person in that moment? Did I have the right skills? Did I have the right links to people? Could I have done more? But that's just to say that I think those moments will always stay with people who have confronted them, and how we learn to talk about them, how we learn to process them, I think can be something that we might miss from time to time. So I think that these kind of spaces are so important to sort of remember that there is a way perhaps of framing these moments in our lives. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alia. And I'm seeing your healing as a part of the revolution is resonating with people on the chat. It's a really beautiful quote. And also I'm thinking of your reference, you know, both to sort of processing and the memories that stay, you know, and the experience of loss, you know, in a lot of this work, of those feelings of inadequacy, you know, despite, I think, the profoundly beautiful intentions, you know, certainly having worked alongside you and so many others, I think that many people carry within this work. And also your reference to that actually sort of serves as quite a fluid bridge, perhaps, into Maddie, if you'd like to join the conversation. And I'm thinking vis-a-vis here, specifically, Maddie is involved in sort of a research group around moral injury, and specifically the experiences of volunteers and staff and activists who have migratory journeys or experiences of refuge seeking, whether that's first or second generation, in terms of their families, and the added sort of complexity, that added lens, you know, in terms of identity association, perception, etc., that brings with that added weight in a way to carry, or added lens as well. But so Maddie, if your mic is working, it'd be lovely to hear from you.
Hopefully working. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for organizing this. There's so many wonderful, familiar faces here, and I know there's going to be so many great perspectives, but yeah, a lot of the work that I've been doing, I've been in the humanitarian sector for 5 years. I entered this space as a complete amateur. I was 21 years old. I had no idea what was going on, and I ended up in Lesbos, completely undertrained, completely underprepared, and through sheer luck of the support system around me, I was able to cultivate psychological resilience. And I absolutely credit all of the people who mentored me through this process, both in the humanitarian space and outside of it, because I've seen several people who are in the same cohort, as you will, as me, entering this space, crashing, burning, and for some of them, unfortunately, never being the same again. And so throughout this process, what I was kind of getting hung up on is that there was this huge emphasis on trauma, which is great. And I went on to go into nursing school and was learning about, you know, the actual pathophysiology of traumatic events and how it creates these actual biological changes in our brains. And it's a fear-based response. And through all of these great therapies, you can actually retrain your brain and your entire body to respond to your triggers. And I'm like, well, that's wonderful. But at no point in my career as a humanitarian did I feel like I identified with the definition of trauma. When people looked at me and they said, oh, well, after seeing all those things and experiencing all those things, you must be traumatized. And I was like, I am, but I'm not. And I felt like there was some sort of definition that was missing for me. There was a way of expressing the way that I was feeling, but I didn't know how. And one of my nursing instructors in school was studying the effects of moral injury on frontline nurses, so specifically emergency room nurses. And that was a phrase that I had never heard before. But the minute it left her mouth, where she's like, wow, it sounds like you've experienced moral injury, I was like, that's it. That's what I'm looking for. And moral injury it's an emerging concept. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it actually stems from research that was done on combat veterans who kind of had the same thing where they're like, okay, well, we don't necessarily tick all the boxes for trauma, and trauma therapies are not working for us, but there's still this deep sense of distress and psychological despair that is happening and that's occurring that we can't seem to get to the bottom of. And so when this research was initiated on combat veterans, it didn't take too long for other sectors and other areas to pick up and see the similarities and where these concepts overlap. So when we refer to moral injury, it's basically what it sounds like. It's still kind of a fluid definition, but it's meant to describe a time where you are forced to transgress your morals in some way. And what that does is that injures you. It injures you spiritually, it injures you emotionally and mentally. And what I've been finding in some of the reading and research that I've done leading up to creating a research team that will be examining this specifically in humanitarians, as well as in sort of exploring the more philosophical side of this concept, is that when we talk about healing from trauma, as I said, there are lots of ways that we can focus on the pathology of trauma, the psychosocial relationships that we have with our traumas, and how we can utilize these safe community healing spaces. But because trauma is a response and a condition, if you will, that's rooted in feelings of fear, so times where you were fearful of something, whereas moral injury is rooted more in guilt and shame, what we're seeing and what we're finding is that the ways that we process moral injury, the ways that we heal from moral injury, are much more rooted in actual collective coping and healing than individual coping and healing. And so everyone who's spoken already has touched upon this already, but the ways that in this sector, I think, unfortunately, what we actually see when it comes to humanitarian self-care, I hate the self-care narrative, because that right there, it's victim blaming. It's saying you, the self, are responsible for your care, when the injuries that we're experiencing and also the traumas, it's due to the environment that we're in, not to any fault of our own. And I think that what we then see is it just perpetuates this endless cycle of guilt and of shame and of feeling like you're never going to fully process and heal because the lens that we're looking at is wrong. I think the intentions around humanitarianism and the wellness and well-being of all of us participating in this type of work is always, the intentions are always good. But if we're not looking at this through the right lens and we're not using the right language and we're not really digging into all of the different ways that this work can injure us, can damage us, and can affect us, we're not going to get to any good solutions for people. And now more than ever, I think we can all agree, since we're all here, we need this. Everyone in this space really needs this, especially that collective healing. And so what I'm hoping to accomplish through this research and through the conversations that we start to have around it is just giving people that another way to describe and talk about what's happening and how they're feeling and how it's affecting them. And hopefully that will then give way to more collective ways that we're working through these types of events, whether they are traumas or moral injuries or a complex combination of both. They're not exclusive by any means. Just hoping that this gives more tools for humanitarians and for the practitioners who are working with them to create a much more productive healing space.
Thank you, Maddie. That was brilliant. And also, I met Maddie recently in Istanbul en route to the trial of our friends. Maddie's also part of Free Humanitarians, which is a campaign that is trying to resource and support and advocate for and with people whose work has been criminalized, whose search and rescue and solidarity and response has been criminalized. So I know a lot of you in this space are familiar with the iteration part of the trial that went on recently in Lesbos, but it was actually through a conversation with Maddie, because moral injury is a concept that we had included in one of the resources, but it really sort of reorientated me personally, in the sense that a lot of the material that we put together for one of the resources is very focused on trauma. So, you know, we have sort of references or sort of an attempt to make accessible some of the terminology around trauma in the brain, trauma in the autonomic nervous system, sort of somatic responses to that, etc., and how we hold and carry it sort of cognitively and physiologically to normalize, people's processes of activation and response. But we were missing something, and that was quite clear to us in the writing of it. So we gestured obviously towards the collective, towards healing, towards processing and peer-to-peer resourcing. But moral injury, when we brought it back to one of the focus groups, was a term that really deeply resonated with so many of those involved. So thank you very much for your reflections, Maddie, and we'd love to hear more also vis-a-vis the specificities of some of that work in the next two questions as well. And I'm thinking for now, perhaps we could move to Paula, who's joining us from Spirasi, who was also part of one of the focus groups. And then I might just give Donna a call to see if she'll be joining us later as well, before we go to Peru and Brendan. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Griva, and thanks everyone. I'm delighted to be able to join you all today. And thanks, Elena, for a beautiful performance. I had a similar quote, or the same quote really, as Gabriella, around self-care being not a luxury but a priority or a necessity. And I suppose I've learned it the hard way. And I would see it like Maddie. I thought it was interesting, just the use of the word injury. I think that has been my experience. And I suppose when I thought about or reflected on some of the practices, or my own maybe work practices that led to depletion and burnout, I thought about just the lack of boundaries. And obviously we develop kind of interpersonal relationships with people we care for. So we're often then prioritizing their needs over our own, or extending ourselves beyond what is reasonable. And I think that happens often when there's poorly defined roles, or in organizations where there's a culture of overwork, or a lack of resources. Also with the kind of intense relentlessness of the work, I find myself sometimes that I could get caught in that energy, whereas I witnessed others being able to kind of stick to kind of the kind of their hours of work. Also the kind of idea or the feeling of irreplaceability is something that definitely wasn't serving. And I think sometimes that can be put on individuals as well, in organizations where maybe certain people take on more responsibility than others. Also, again, what Gabrielle was saying around organizational policies, and maybe self-care being talked about but not being kind of valued and included or implemented in organizational policies. And in terms of practices that are generative, and I think we'll be talking more about that in terms of affirming. I think the collegial kind of practice of being able to kind of stop and actually debrief in the moment. I know that was some of the feedback, that often people are left holding things for a long period of time. So I think just acknowledging that we're all human with strengths, and different strengths and weaknesses can be really helpful, because obviously other colleagues can bolster you with their own individual strengths. So I think just the organizational being really important as well, a culture that actually fosters teamwork. I remember working in the MRCI where we had breakfast together every week, and that being a really good example. But also I think organizations actually having kind of ongoing reflection, because I think within the culture of overwork, it can actually hide kind of the real capacity or the true capacity of an organization. I think that often I've experienced that within the work that I've done. So we'll come back to talking about these points, but I'm delighted to be here with everyone.
Thank you so much, Paula. And I'm thinking, I'm remembering as you speak a quote that we used in the resource, vis-a-vis what a concept, I think, or a term that sometimes meets with a certain resistance vis-a-vis boundaries. And we were sort of thinking about how to, hold it and perhaps reconceptualize it in a way that resonated with people, vis-a-vis almost limits of capacity or limits of endurance, and sort of that stage in which overwhelm and depletion, begins. But I found your insights into that so useful at the time, in the sense of really talking about ego within that and sort of irreplaceability, and when we're sort of a depleted, overwhelmed version of ourselves, what is our duty to care not only to ourselves but also to the communities that we're trying to accompany when sometimes they're left, at least on an interpersonal or relational level, intersubjective level, carrying some of that stress as well, noticing our activation. So thank you so much. And I'm thinking perhaps we could go to Peru now. And Peru is joining us with various different hats, but is very much involved in the Refugee Solidarity Summit that took place last year and will take place this year, but again contains within it spaces, intentional spaces for really exploring some of this material, hopefully with depth. Thank you.
Hi guys, can you all hear me okay? I'm having some slight issues with my, okay. Yeah, it's really good to be here with you all and to hear the beautiful music. I think that set the scene so well, because I was feeling a little nervous, and then that just kind of, it's very soothing. And to hear from all my colleagues, many of whom I know, if not just by name or by contact through the web, whether we've met, few of you we've met in person and we've worked together. So it's great to be here. And there's just so much in this. It's just so rich. It's difficult to even know kind of where to come at this, but as you said, Quiver, I'm here with different hats. And one of them is that I began my journey as a humanitarian, if you want to use that term, in much the way that Maddie described, kind of accidentally. I was a human being compelled by shock, by anger, by the desire to do something about what I was seeing kind of unfolding. And this would be 2015. And like many people, I kind of jumped into action with very little background or resource or training, and went and kind of dived in and begun a journey which began doing work in Calais, and then eventually to Greece, to the island of Samos. And ran projects supporting volunteers and mobilizing volunteers, doing advocacy work, engaging on the ground with the various different actors that were there, running projects. So I had this kind of, like many grassroots people, I had so many different hats on. And I think this is one of the things that was really important that's been mentioned by other people, is that the lack of capacity, the lack of resource, the lack of funding means that it's really not necessarily a choice that organizations make. It's very much just that in order to do what they did, particularly, I think things have changed and evolved a little bit now, but going back a few years, in order to be effective and do what we did, we felt that we had no choice. We may even have known that it was necessary to have training or a better understanding or some policies in place, but the response was very much kind of action orientated. And And now with reflection, I think perhaps that, you know, empathic distress was a factor. You know, I think that I was very distressed by what I saw, and my desire to respond was coming from a place of distress rather than from a place of resilience and capacity and sort of skill. But you know, as Maddie said, that network is an amazing. It's amazing the amount of support that people are able to give each other, and there was a very steep learning curve, and I think that so many amazing things were accomplished. It's really important not to be too critical of our approaches. But long story short, you know, I came back from being in an extended period on the ground in 2017 from Greece, having experienced some pretty harrowing things, you know, in person, in my own body. And this is something that I feel is really important to stipulate what's kind of enforced my feelings since then. Is I'm a yoga teacher. I was already a yoga teacher before beginning this work. Alongside other things, I've used yoga as a kind of self-care or just coping or kind of processing tool for a really long time. But I noticed a lot of people talking about vicarious trauma, you know, how responders were experiencing vicarious trauma. And I kept thinking, vicarious doesn't quite feel like it sums it up, because my understanding of trauma is, you know, that the body, trauma doesn't discriminate. If your body, if your nervous system is, if you're activated and your autonomic nervous system response is activated, your body is experiencing that in real time. It's not necessarily going to say, oh, well, this person isn't in danger, they can get on a flight, they can go home, you know, this person has choices. Of course, all of those things are true. But if you're caught in a situation on the ground, which is very difficult and challenging, that's happening to you in your body at that time. And I found that people were very dismissive of that experience in themselves, and the organizations and the network as a whole was quite dismissive of that. You know, I would see individuals being shut down, you know, perhaps on social media for expressing their pain or their anguish over something they'd experienced. There was a lot of people, you know, saying quite unsupported things like, well, imagine, you know, well, at least you can go home, or at least you can, you know, do this. It was a real distinctive lack of compassion. And I realized that all of us were essentially triggered, for want of a better word. You know, we were going through this massive moral injury. I mean, we live in a culture, in a world, I think, which is categorized by, we're all morally injured, living in the world that we're having to live in at the moment, because so many terrible things are happening that we have no control or influence over. I feel that you're constantly feeling a little bit activated. And there didn't seem to be enough of a sort of system for examining this. There was no praxis, no reflection. Everything was very action orientated. And I was guilty of this myself. I came back and I was teetering on the edge of burnout, you know, and I didn't even really recognize it in myself. And I went straight into trying to do for others, you know. So I was setting up some retreats for people to come together and talk and create sharing spaces, and had yoga teachers and practitioners, and it was all very well and good, but there was a kind of hollowness to it in the fact that I wasn't supporting or looking after myself. And that culminated in, personally, a very difficult and sort of shocking thing, which was really wrapped up in lots of shame and guilt, as we've talked about, which was that I was diagnosed with PTSD. And I was completely shocked. I was so shocked, because I thought, I can't have PTSD. You know, I run training, I run workshops, I'm a yoga teacher, I know how to deal with all this stuff. But actually, it was so embodied, it was so locked in, and just not having a process of acceptance and recognizing the symptoms in myself, I was just pushing it down, pushing it down, pushing it down. I was totally dissociated a lot of the time. I was working very action orientated, but going through some really difficult things personally. I was very mentally unwell. And so that, I put the brakes on at that point and disengaged completely from sort of field work, didn't go back to Greece, didn't go back to France, began to, with a group of other people that were experiencing similar things in themselves, some of them are in this group, we began talking a long time back about the need to have a network of support. You know, as Maddie was saying, that we could deal with these things in ourselves, in our bodies, but we really also need to acknowledge that we're a grassroots movement. We are, in a sense, this is resistance, you know, and we're resisting against big interlocking oppressive systems that are designed to alienate us and make us fall apart. You know, we're very under-resourced. In many cases, we're underskilled. So we need to come together and we need to resource ourselves by pooling those things that we do know, you know, by sharing and pooling our experiences. And I'll stop talking in a minute, but the summit was a kind of an evolution of thought, something that grew from various different small groups into this much larger thing, which was about bringing people into the same space, specifically grassroots groups. It was really important to us to find the funds that we could facilitate bringing people, because money is always so much of an issue, and there's very rarely money dedicated within grassroots networks to this kind of work. I mean, I'm sure all of you that are doing these projects know, if you're looking for money for kind of crisis orientated things, people will give gladly, but to get money to protect the helpers, to help the helpers, is so challenging. And so we had to go to some really unusual sources to find the funds in order that we could make it so that people could come from all over Europe. They could leave their work and fly and join us. They would be put up in a hotel, or they would be supported by other people in their homes. So it wasn't just an event, it was like a giant sort of holding space on so many different levels. And we did that in a really grassroots way, because we realized that this sort of organizational, glossy, professionalized thing that we're seeing happening to certain grassroots organizations is founded on very little. You know, when it all crumbles down, there's nothing left. We need to build it from the roots up. So that's individuals giving each other lifts, people supporting, hosting people in their homes, people kind of bringing their ideas. So the summit was a 2-day event, and it was built from the contributions of those that were attending. So there wasn't really a distinction between audience and participants, so to speak. You know, there were 200 plus organizations represented, and many, many more individuals who are independently operating. And they created the content, they shaped the discussions, they ran the workshops, they ran the training, they shared their successes, people talked about their challenges. It was really, really beautiful, but lots of revealing things came from that. And one of them was that still action-orientated, crisis-focused, can we stop meditating and talk about, you know, the problems? You know, there's this very sort of drive-focused approach. And I feel that that's symptomatic of a larger issue. You know, I think that it's another Audre Lorde quote that comes to mind, which is the quote about his master's tools, you know. And I think that that's the thing that we need to really keep in our mind as grassroots operators, is that if we seek to replicate the same systems of organizing, hierarchical, top-down, aggressive, unsympathetic, lacking in compassion, the products will be the same no matter how hard we try. You know, we have to change the tools to dismantle the house. And that means that we have to have systems of compassion. We have to engage with praxis. We have to not be so action orientated and support our helpers. You know, that we were fodder. So many young people were just fodder to this cause. You know, from 2015 to 17, there were too many people crying alone in their rooms, too many people. And I heard that from a lot of different sources, you know, and that was kind of what motivated this movement. And I'm so happy to see this conversation, this work being done, to hear all these different people feeling the same way and having the same discussion. So thank you for letting me be here and waffle on.
Definitely not waffle, and so interesting, Prue. And I'm glad that we still have time and space to go further and deeper into that. But I found that a very, poignant, almost metaphor for a lot of, in a way, the casualties of the last few years, particularly, I think, and it's not age specific, because I think people have different ways of processing it, but certainly I resonate with that, having met some very deeply, deeply committed young folks who just didn't have the resourcing really that they needed. And but yeah, I thought it very poignant, just that reference to young and older, but specifically in this case, young people, trying to process with so little support, grief, oftentimes, and huge sort of philosophical, existential, spiritual, sometimes bodily pain around that witness. And yeah, I've been so, I think, moved. I think a lot of us working on this have, by I think what also that honesty, that you're bringing into this space, but that we witnessed in a lot of the focus group participants as well, in terms of really, bringing it back to the personal, in terms of experiences of burnout or rust out and activation and depletion and overwhelm, and also, deep vicarious resilience and post-traumatic growth, and courage and tenacity and joy. There was a lot of joy and humor in the spaces as well, and love, a lot of love, which was very humbling to be around. So thank you. I'm thinking now, Brendan, Donna, I think, so just to contextualize before we go to Brendan, just in case Donna can't join us, but Donna, amongst other things, is also a parent and a carer to 4 beautiful young children, as well as being a full-time master's student, an activist, an organizer, an advocate. But she's one of the founding core members of the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, which has been an asylum seeker-led, really, really impactful movement for change in Ireland on a legislative level, on a policy level, and also on a grassroots level, vis-a-vis challenging the injustice of the iteration of sort of hostile migration policies that exist in this context, which is the system of direct provision. But Donna also has responded with a lot of attention and attendance to the need for psychosocial resourcing of their organizers throughout of the multiple responsibilities and roles that they held along the way, and in a very non-abstract way to moral injury. So hopefully she'll join us later. If she doesn't, I think in the aftermath of this, we'll send some links around to their work, because I think for those of us who are participating today who aren't from Ireland, they're really a source of deep inspiration, learning, and companionship to us all in this work. So I think we'll go now to the very patient Brendan, and I say patient in the sense that he just got off a night shift, and is operating on 1 hour's sleep. So hopefully he's still awake. But Brendan, I think really speaks to, and perhaps will speak to, but some of what was glimpsed in some of the quotes, which were primarily from search and rescue personnel engaged in both the Central Mediterranean and Aegean at different times. So you're very welcome to this space, Brendan.
Thank you very much for having me. I've got to say, listening to the other panelists, I don't know if I've got a whole great deal to offer in terms of the wealth of knowledge and understanding that's completely evident from hearing what people have had to say, but I could talk about my experiences and what I've seen, which is what I'm going to do. I suppose the first thing I would perhaps touch upon is how can you look after others without having first looked after yourself? You can't, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough. You can't really provide the support for the others that we're here to help and support without having the resilience, without having the rest, without being capable of processing everything that we've seen and dealt with. One of the organizations I work with is called Sea-Watch, and I didn't appreciate it the first time that I went with them, but they do a a mental health briefing first and then a debriefing afterwards, which is done as a collective, and it's something that I'd not experienced before with other organisations that I'd worked with. I had it with Lighthouse Relief, where we'd had debriefs after each day. We'd have a debrief, a collective debrief over breakfast, and these things are really important, I think. But I think one of the things I wanted to just touch upon really briefly is recognition that there's different types of volunteers, and obviously different types of people as well. We'll have myself, like, for example, would be a persistent short-term volunteer. I've got a full-time job. I've never left it. I use my annual leave to go out and do the rescue missions and other bits and bobs that I do. But I'm there, for 3 weeks, 4 weeks or something, and then I come home. My needs for rest, my needs for coping with that, they're still there, but they're not as obvious as perhaps the longer term volunteers that were there. But equally, they're quite acute. So the difference between the different volunteers that I noticed would be, you'd have long term volunteers that never took a day off, and you could see them absolutely exhausted and drained. And each time a new person would come for a couple of weeks, be like, oh, I've got to go through this process again of telling them how everything works. And oh God, it felt almost like the new people were drained. But also, those new people that were coming could see those people absolutely exhausted. And I think, as Sea-Watch does, they'll give you a day off, and they'll, as an organisation, they build in time for you not to be working. And I think in order to sustain prolonged periods of time of doing this kind of traumatic work, we have to inbuild, as organisations, time for people to be away from it and to process what they've had to deal with, and to have some scope of normality in their lives, because you can become obsessive. It can just completely overwhelm and overtake every single thought that you have from, well, even while you're asleep. And then there's the short-term volunteers who aren't always used to dealing with such traumatic and such moral injustices in your face that you will arrive with on day one. You can turn up and you can see people. You could see people drowning in front of you. You could see people, shivering cold on a beachfront. You could see all manners of horrors and traumas on your first day, and the impacts of those can be from going from a life where you're not dealing with that day in, day out, day after day, to suddenly having to arrive and deal with something horrific, and then everybody else is around you is going back to they're used to it and they're coping because they've done it for weeks and months. I think that can be quite harrowing and acute, and perhaps we need to deal with those situations better. I've got to say, in terms of psychological support, I'm no expert, so I'm going to leave that to the people that are, and I'm going to step away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan. And part of the, I think, the weaving of today is very much to say, that we're all in a way experts in our own experience. So although there is that sort of psychotherapeutic, psychosocial, etc. lens, that in terms of the framing and language around some of these resources, that we're so clear, that nobody knows their own processes better than those who navigate them. So I definitely would say never to diminish your lived experience, and it's been so important, particularly in the development of sort of the processes that we've gone through over the last couple of years, to have the specificity of a search and rescue perspective and witness, because it's something, I think that has stayed with so many who have been involved in that work, that front line of, the impossible choices that oftentimes search and rescue personnel have to make on such a frequent basis, and the pain, that continues in the aftermath of that. And certainly, I think over the years, your voice has been such a prescient, important one, and it makes sense now, hearing the fact that you kept continuity vis-a-vis work, and life and community, while going back and forth, but just to have that little bit of space and perspective sometimes vis-a-vis, that what you referred to, that sort of obsessive, almost desire and, to respond, but to a point that people do oftentimes, get very, very depleted. So thank you. And your witness also is a great segue now into Pat, from Refugee Rescue, whom I know that you've shared probably physical and geographical space with, but also, a lot of resonance and commonality of experience. And Pat, amongst other hats, also researches and writes and publishes around systematic human rights violations, pushbacks, and policy and state complicity in human rights violations vis-a-vis the women, men, and children who are on the move seeking refuge across very militarized, securitized borders in Europe. So you're really welcome to this space, Pat. Thank you. And thank you, Brendan.
Thanks, everyone. Hi. I was thinking about what I could share. I think today we had a lot of perspectives, and I thought something that I could bring is how a reflection on also how we as organizations are complicit in not taking care of the mental health of our own. And I think that's very important because it's something that I felt in first person through my experience. I think I started in this line of work because I always wanted to. I felt really drawn to migration, refugee issues, etc. So the day after my graduation, when I was 22, I moved to Lebanon and I started working there with refugees. I was fresh out of school and they gave me a full team of volunteers to manage. They gave me a lot of responsibility. I was completely underpaid, sometimes not even paid. We were not knowing if we're going to get paid next month or not. And that lasted, I think, all in all for a year that I spent there. And I just remember after my contract, when my contract was coming to an end, I felt extremely burnt out. Like I did not know that's how it was called, but I know that that's how, now looking back, that's exactly how I was feeling, right? I lost all my motivation to work. I just felt like I dreaded every single day. I felt like I had this sense of like, I can't even manage myself. How am I supposed to manage a whole team of volunteers? That was a feeling that I had for a long time. And when my contract was coming to an end and they wanted to renew, I felt like I just, the dream that I always had to work in this area and to support these people on the move was just maybe not for me, and that I had to go. I was not strong enough, or I was not like just prepared to do this kind of work. And at that time, a friend of mine who was working at the private sector told me they were hiring. And I was like, maybe I'll try. I mean, maybe working for NGOs and grassroots, it's not my thing. So maybe I should just go to the private sector. And then I joined the private sector. And I have to say that most of my learnings when it comes to resilience and when it comes to boundaries came from that experience, which was brief, but it was also quite fantastic because I just remember it was a time of my life where I used to sit in meetings that were talking about budget. You know, we need to bring all this money in for this quarter. And I used to sit there and think, I don't care. Like, no, I don't care. Like, I did not feel the urge of like working harder. I did not feel the need of, you know, overextending myself because I didn't care about making money for these people. Like, I just didn't care. And it was a fantastic feeling I never felt. And I remember, you know, like you would clock out at 9 and then leave at 5. I had all the afternoon for myself. I never took work home. The weekends, like that was a discovery, like having weekends, being able to just like have weekends, have fun with your friends and family and plan things, take holidays. And I remember when, again, like after I was like, maybe I want to give grassroots and NGO work like another chance, but taking all these learnings, especially like boundaries that I learned from this time in the private sector, I want to take it with me because I felt like, I felt extremely happy. I felt like super capable. I felt like I had like, I was myself again. And it was fantastic. And that reconnected me also with my my eagerness to go back to working with migration issues and refugees, etc. And I did, and I went to Greece, and I started working with a very small NGO. And I was very, clear on my boundaries, and I was very clear on the kind of things that I needed to do this work. But I felt like what I needed for my mental health to be okay was not acceptable for the kind of work we were doing. And I felt like battling again, and I realized that it was not my problem that I was weak or that I just did not know how to handle myself. I felt, as all of you shared, it was part of the culture. I felt there was this culture of like urgency, like things need to happen now or yesterday, even before. No, it's not now, it's always yesterday. And you're always like under-resourced, and there's always like not enough people, and especially like there's always more you can do. It is never enough. No, you can do your job description, but it's always never enough. You're always expected to do more and more and more. And I remember trying to take my weekends or trying to take some time off, and it was always really frowned upon. And I felt that was kind of like a very isolating experience as well, because I felt everyone around me was in this cycle of like overworking, and I could see things that I had experienced myself happening to them, but also not wanting to get into the wheel. I felt it was a very like a big disconnect. Somehow my boundaries got blurred again because it was extremely hard. I felt like from the board, from my coworkers, it was always expected. And from that, like after I went to Jordan, I went to Iraq, I went back to Lesbos. And I always kind of had this learning with me, but I kind of started to analyze, because afterwards I had more like coordination roles, right? And then I was like, I now have the ability or the power to control a little bit and to enforce these boundaries and to enforce everything that I've been learning. And I remember when I went back to Lesbos after, I think it was a couple of years, and I was working for a small NGO, I saw a lot of volunteers, and especially a lot of young people getting really burned out, but also abandoning their lives to stay in the island. That's something that to me was really shocking, to see 19-year-olds who are choosing not to go to university or to cancel all their plans because they had to stay in the island, and they had to stay there, and they had to, like it was never enough, and they had to work, and if they left, something bad would happen. I've seen a lot of people getting into these cycles. I saw a lot of people also, coordinators refusing to take time off, refusing to get off, refusing to also talk to therapists. And it was crazy because on some part I felt really responsible, because obviously a lot of NGOs in Lesbos were hiring young volunteers, not paying them and giving them huge amounts of responsibility, which that does a lot to your mental health, not in a good way. And I feel like it also happens with search and rescue in the Mediterranean. I feel, as Brandon said, there's a lot of types of volunteers, but I think there's one type of volunteer, for example, who does mission after mission. No, maybe not with the same NGO, they change NGOs, but they go mission after mission, and we're allowing that because we take this person to go on our mission when we know they just finished a mission and they just finished another mission. But we do not think, no, I think, I can't remember which one of the panelists said the sentence of self-care is not a luxury, it's a priority. I think this has happened, but it is never, at least in the times that I've worked or the organizations that I've worked with, the communities that I've seen, it's always felt as a luxury. It's always felt as, okay, now that we have the money and things are running smoothly, now maybe we can think about how to support the mental health of our colleagues. But it has never felt as a priority of, okay, like this needs to happen in parallel. Or when it has happened, I remember we tried in Lesbos, for example, to, every time we're hiring a coordinator, we're saying, okay, if you accept this role, just for you to know, there's going to be a check-in with a psychologist once a month. So you need to accept this in order for us to be able to hire you. So we kind of piloted that. And then we felt like it was falling through the cracks. They felt like everything else was more urgent than their talk with the therapist. And then no one was going to talk to the therapist. And if we kept reminding them, they were like, no, we have this thing with our team. We have this thing with other things. And it never felt as a priority. And I think this is something we're lacking to. I don't have the answer as well. I just want to say, I don't have the answer on how we can enforce this. But I think another big issue that we're failing to tell, not only our volunteers, but I think everyone around us, is that the issues we're working with on, they're systemic issues. you're not going to solve them yourself as a person spending a year in Lesbos. You're not going to spend them working 3 weeks there or all your life. It's something that one is systemic, and it's a system that it's made to feel you like it's to make you feel like this. It's a system made to basically burn people out. It's a system made to make you feel frustrated, make you feel hopeless. And something that has helped me a lot is also to stop feeling that me as an individual, obviously you can make an impact as a person, but I think being connected as a community, being connected to people, not only in the island you're working with, but also in like other parts of the world who are doing the same work you're doing, that also helped me a lot. I think realizing that people who are working against border violence and working against, the racism of border issues, it's people everywhere around the world. And I think that should also allow you to take a bit of a break and a rest, because even if you stop for 4 years to go to university, these people are going to be working on this. And then when you are feeling ready, you're feeling better and you can continue working on this, you can just rejoin the community and they're going to be, very open and happy. And I think this is something we failed to address, the fact that it's not a crisis, it's not a moment in time, but these issues are protracted. They've been happening forever. And that's also part of what I think our mental health is quite affected, because we do not realize how the system is made and works against not only people who cross borders, but also against people who try to work with them. So I think I'm going to shut up now. That was a lot, but I think there's some reflections that I thought were important to make.
Thank you, Pat. That was so important, I think, to be articulated in this space this morning, vis-a-vis systemic injustice, but also that feeling that I think we've all witnessed in colleagues and comrades and volunteers and staff and workers, but vis-a-vis sort of irreplaceability, and how do we sit sort of in places of transition, around roles, transition around whether or not we're physically present, with the relationships that are dear to us, with communities that are on the move. How can we perhaps, transition and occupy other roles, vis-a-vis whether that's advocating, against the policies that are condemning people to such profoundly, difficult experiences of loss and trauma. But I really have always appreciated, Pat, your humor within this as well, in the sense of, just really staying grounded. And I think oftentimes, it's very easy for us all to take ourselves very seriously. And, and part of that is a response, to the gravitas of the situation. But I think taking, reorientating in terms of that lived experience, to that of the communities that we're trying to accompany, and that space for joy and humor and cynicism and subversiveness and, community and celebration, that they hold along the way as well, is so important in terms of integrating that into our practice as well. So thank you so much. And I'm thinking that perhaps because throughout the past sort of time of interventions, I think that you've all touched upon in many ways the 3 lines of inquiry that I sent around. But I'm thinking what might be useful for people, because there were reflections on sort of what organizations and institutions are doing, quote unquote, wrong vis-a-vis that lack of resourcing, that lack of sort of systemic integrative approaches, that lack of space of healing, that lack of space, really resourcing, peer-to-peer resourcing as well. But what I might ask, if we go back around, and the loop doesn't have to be the same order that it existed in before, although we might go back to Gabriela, if that's okay, and then whomever wants to sort of take it up past there, but is sort of specific, whether that is processes or communities or modalities, or sort of intentional pauses that you found useful. And I'm thinking, Gabriela, specifically vis-a-vis the work that you've been doing with the hub, and also sort of what you might recommend, to other groups, whether that is peer-to-peer resourcing, or something, with more intentionality as well. What has been useful for you? What after those conversations has emerged, and then after Gabriela, maybe each person could offer, if you feel moved to, some reflections on that too. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got to apologise if I keep disappearing. I'm having a terrible connection morning, so I missed some of what you've been saying, but it's been incredibly rich and I think really highlighted the obvious need for, I guess, what we're moving into now, which is what can we do about it? So I think what everybody's describing in really useful terms as well, like moral injury and kind of empathic distress is this impact. And I think what we have found at RTI, and I know from my personal experience, is there's a huge amount of resourcing that we can do between ourselves, which is through really thinking about like, what do I need and what do we need as an organization? And then what are our responsibilities to facilitate that before you even think about more kind of specialist support that is needed in some circumstances and is needed to support organizations. So I think on an organizational level, there is a really important piece, which is about organizational responsibility. And I think, as Peru was describing and many others, a lot of organizations in it's quite unique setting, kind of the Europe context in terms of humanitarian organizations being predominantly volunteer-based or kind of very low paid, and predominantly starting with groups of incredible people like the speakers and attendees of this forum, really turning up out of incredible goodwill and a kind of compulsion to help others at this time, given what we have all been witnessing and supporting. But I think now we're kind of 5 or 6 years on, there is a responsibility. We're not in the beginning where people are turning up kind of as individuals and forming collectives. Though a lot of the organizations that exist now have been existing for 5 or 6 years. And I think that is enough time to put in place certain policies that also mean something in practice, that support teams to do their work to the best of their ability as safely as possible. And I think that these are really basic things like safeguarding policies. Does your organization have one? And is it reactive or is it responsive? Does it really think about the circumstances that you have learned from over the last 5 or 6 years? And does it make sense and relevance to your context? Because lots of times I think they're really old, outdated documents, or they're just a template from somewhere else, and they need, I know it's boring, but they kind of need to be live documents that respond to your particular circumstances and are also accessible and easy to understand and easy to follow and updated according to what changes take place in your organization. Is there focal points in terms of safeguarding and in terms of well-being, and if in cases of higher levels of need, do you know who to go to? And are the people that you need to go to in your organizations people who have A, the skills, and B, the support in order to hold that responsibility? Holding a safeguarding responsibility is a great responsibility. So are you supported by your organization? Have you attended trainings that are relevant to your context? There are a huge amount of resources available in terms of training. There's some that are free. You know, do you prioritize investing in that? And then I think from a well-being perspective, there are, sorry, just in terms of organization, there's also, so what is the induction process and what is the training for people before they enter this work? Is it explained to them what they're coming into? Is their role clear? Are they frontline or are they supporting something backstage and kind of more operational? And if so, has there been an induction process that really helps somebody to understand like what they're coming into, what their roles are, what the expectations are, what to do if? It doesn't, again, need to be a huge process, but, you know, have you done some training on trauma sensitive practice? Have you done some training or some support and induction about thinking about identity, thinking about the kind of different relationships and dynamics in the organization? Who is in the team? You know, has some of that been brought into awareness, and is there preparation for that? I think also the other thing is really linking to what sharing so far from their personal experience is is there any process as people are leaving as well about debriefing or just some sort of grounding process, because that, you know, the exposure to moral injury and the kind of impact on us, when you really see the kind of systemic injustices and failure and harm being perpetuated on top of the individual costs day in, day out, is extreme. And so integrating that and supporting somebody to make a little bit of sense of that and think, what do I do with it? And just helping somebody to transition out back into their everyday world is something that is a big ask, I think, of humanitarian organizations, given how stretched they are, but in an ideal world would be something that we work towards providing support for within an organization or within the sector. And you know, who could that be? Is it a well-being person in your team? Is it an HR person? It's a kind of conversation that some people really enjoy holding, facilitating, and once you get practiced at, you know, it's something that people can become good at. So I think from a policy perspective, entering, leaving, and safeguarding are really important. Then there's the kind of attitude of management. So one of the questions we were asked as the speakers is kind of advice to management, which is, do you take organizational well-being seriously as managers? And if not, what do you need to do to recognize that it is important? Because it's not only about your staff team, but it's also about the impact on the people you're providing a service to, most importantly, or it's all equally important. So what kind of inner work do you need to do to take this a bit seriously and to actually have somebody within your organization that is supporting you as founder or leaders or the kind of management team to make sure that well-being is integrated into your organization. And then I think on an organizational level, there's so many different things that one can do, and you just have to think about your different contexts. So I think in the first instance, you don't need specialists to hold these spaces, but what you do need is someone or some people within your organization who do have skills, and that doesn't mean they need to be a therapist. It doesn't even need to be, they need to be a counselor, but it needs to be someone who who has the capacity, who has a demonstrated capacity before they start this role to hold difficult feelings, to hold spaces, to be able to welcome difficult feelings and support teams in reflective practice, in team meetings, to be able to share as people need to share. So there's live kind of processing, there's spaces where teams can reflect. That was a really difficult day. I feel really disturbed by that. Somebody might need to cry. We might need to shake it out as a group. We might need to have a laugh together, but somebody who can kind of recognize what is going on with individuals and recognize what is going on with a group, and who is comfortable facilitating a group process and welcoming difficult feelings without them becoming overwhelmed or dysregulated. And we highly recommend, and this is what the pilot's for, it's training people to be able to facilitate practices within teams that support co-regulations. That's really like group well-being, kind of helping recognize what's happening in a wider group, and then support individuals as well. And we're going to be starting hopefully a new pilot program next year. So if your organizations is something that you're looking for, then we will share with this collective kind of information about it. But simple things, so in team meetings, do you have check-ins, do you have check-outs, do you have spaces where people just share, this is how I'm coming today, where anything is welcome. You don't have to come feeling happy, you don't have to come feeling okay, you can come feeling tired, so that we bear witness to each other. Thinking about things like living circumstances, a huge piece was the fact that people don't have any time out from work, from volunteering. And I know that this feels like a luxury, but I think it's something that really needs to be thought about. Even if people have to live in flats together, what support or what thinking is there to support people to not feel like they have to participate in every group activity and every meal after work, so that people have time for themselves, they have time to resource in their own personal ways. And then reflective practice spaces. I think one of the biggest feedbacks we got on top of all of the training and the capacity building and the program was spaces where humanitarians, calling them today, from different organizations have opportunities to share with each other. And I think hearing that other people are experiencing what you're experiencing can be incredibly powerful, to feel that you're not alone. And then sharing ideas with each other. And I think especially for people in the well-being roles, this is really, really important to kind of be connected to other people. But I know that, you know, connecting people on Samos, suddenly they were like, oh my God, it's so good to hear like what your organization is doing and how you're working with it, and collaborations came out of it. And that's where the peer support can sustain and communities can keep supporting each other. So I'll stop there, but I think there's an organizational level, and then there's a personal level. And the final piece is self-care is a NAF term, and it's not, I think we have to kind of move away from it being this kind of yuppie, self-helpy thing that it's kind of become with the title, and recognize, I think it's a responsibility of organizations to explore with volunteers and staff as they're coming in. What do you do for your self-care? You know, is it music? Is it going for walks? Just to have a bit of a conscious conversation so that someone's reminded, because sometimes when someone's feeling overwhelmed, it can feel quite scary for organizations. They think, oh my God, we can't deal with this, and that person's got to stop, and it can escalate. And actually, sometimes what someone needs is someone sit down with them and have a cup of tea and listen to how they are and what they're feeling, and just to explore what would help them to ground. And sometimes it is as simple as, I think I need to just go for a walk, you know, by the sea, or actually this music is really soothing, or I need to have 2 days off just to kind of replenish myself. And then somebody can resource and they can keep going. And I think that will really help the more we build confidence in this, to reduce some of the burnout culture and the turnover. Sorry, I just rammed a lot of stuff in there. So
no, that was brilliant, Gabriella. And I was actually thinking as you were speaking, I'm going to ask our lovely comms coordinator if we can extract that as a piece of video and just share it, because I think in a way, like, you touched upon it all in a really, just integrated, succinct, brilliant way. So not at all. I could have listened to you for another hour easily, which I wish I could. But yeah, the conversation will continue post this interface, most definitely. And I'm thinking, just because we don't have so much time left, but if maybe folks, if anybody feels sort of moved to add to that, or to bring in something, you know, that has worked or resonated with folks within their movements, their organizations or groups, etc., it would be really welcome. But there's also no pressure as well. But I see Maddie there potentially.
Yeah, sorry, because I'm going to have to run like right on the half hour. But I wanted to share, I'm going to pop it in the chat as well. I've been working through this book that was recommended to me by a friend. It's called Rebellious Morning. It's by AK Press. I don't know how many people have heard of this book before, but this, I had read excerpts from this book, as well as excerpts from some of the things that others, including Cindy, have written. And I think that first of all, this would be a great resource for people just to explore on their own, or to encourage groups of people to explore. But what was so powerful for me in, recognizing this as a resource is that collective space, and also the validation. And this was touched upon by almost every single person as part of the magic and the importance of that peer support, is that it's been expressed either by our own experiences or through others that we're working with, that if you're misunderstood by the people who are supposed to be coming to support you, that creates a whole new rift, and actually for a lot of people, trauma, where you're suddenly, if you think back to the ways that we communicate as children, as toddlers, we have, what do toddlers do when we can't understand what they're trying to tell us? They have a temper tantrum. And so of course it's in our nature to suddenly become dysregulated and distressed when you feel like people are not understanding you. And so I think what I had emphasized earlier with, using terms like moral injury or secondary trauma, empathetic distress, there's a lot of really great terminology that's been thrown around that can be useful communication tools for people. But I feel like for a lot of us too, when we are really overwhelmed, or if we have, heaven forbid, reached the point of being burned out, it's hard for you to find the words. And so what can be really helpful in maybe a more passive way of processing versus coming into a group setting and feeling like you have to produce something, like, how are you feeling, answering questions or being anything, this reading other people's experiences is a much more passive and non-confrontational way to still get that peer support in a sense, and to still get that solidarity without feeling like you have to actually show up for it, if that makes sense. And otherwise, you know, as someone who runs an organization, someone who is a medical professional, and so oftentimes in these spaces, I am the default person that people come to. I couldn't agree more with Gabriella about ways that organizations can become more resilient and structurally sound and prepared for when these types of incidences occur with their volunteers or their staff. And as well as, yeah, just helping people find those little things to just first and foremost regulate their nervous system, get comfortable in their bodies once again, because as Prue mentioned too, you know, even if the actual traumatic event didn't feel like it impacted us directly, you are there having that experience, witnessing it in your body and with your body. And so those small steps to even get to the point of being able to rest and process are also really important for us to encourage people to participate in.
Thank you so much, Maddie. And I'm wondering if there's other participants, I'm thinking Prue, but also anybody who feels Alia would like to contribute.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can just jump in because I'm not entirely sure how long my connection will
Hey,
will
thank
last
you.
with us. But I think just to, I think I was in the beginning thinking of those kind of macro level things. What can people do? And I think it's been articulated so much better than I could have by Gabrielle, and also then adding to what Maddie has been saying. For me, any organization you step into, you are stepping into a culture. It doesn't really matter how big that organization is, whether it's a grassroots, whether it's a big INGO, you're stepping into a culture, and that culture has been created by the people who are working within it. And so I think that's why it's so important that we're talking about what we're talking about, because these are the things that you immediately receive and you absorb. And once that's set in, it's actually kind of difficult then to navigate out of that. And so I think being really conscious of the fact that when you create a grassroots, or when you create any structure, you are creating a culture and a work culture, and how you, and for me, increasingly in this work, and as I develop a little bit, hopefully on my personal sort of reflections, what's becoming more important to me is like, how am I doing the work? And it's not, so I think a lot of us have spoken a lot about how we're so super action driven and super maybe solution orientated, and we're always looking for, you know, ways to go around something, circumvent an issue, resist some kind of oppression. But how are we doing that? I think increasingly to me matters. And I think like finding a harmony between the what of the work and the way of the work, because speaking quite frankly, in the larger aid sectors, if there's a huge program and you can say we're assisting X number of people, but if your team that's doing that is so depleted and so stressed out and not sleeping, what are you actually doing? Well, what are we actually doing? And how is that actually collectively, are we moving in this movement towards something that's helpful for society? And so I think increasingly, like the reason why these conversations are so important for me is that I'm more and more interested in the how, as well as I think that like there's so many elements that have been spoken about that just have reminded me of this reflection that I've been kind of doing. So I just wanted to add it in here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alia. And I'm also just really grateful that you managed, because I can see, I know that there's things demanding your attention off of camera, but thank you. You've been amazing. And to give us this chunk of time, because Alia is on the move in various different contexts at the moment. But yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I'm thinking maybe just so we've got another like 4 minutes before we have to close. But just to say that the resources that we've been working on, which are in process, we're just in the sort of the final design stages. So we have them up as placeholders, but I'd actually urge perhaps for you to wait until January, when we'll have the fully designed versions. And again, none of them are rocket science. They're very much, just one more iteration of the many other resources that are out there. So we're not trying to position them as anything revelatory, but yeah, they've at the very least, hopefully with integrity, honor the time from the focus groups that was given to them, and can sit alongside the many other projects and attempts to sort of work with some of this dough that exists out there at the moment. But I'm wondering, maybe Peru, do you want to just add for a couple of minutes? And then we had hoped that we'd have time for Elena Jacobi's beautiful song again, but I think we might not. So what I proposed to her is that we send a link to a beautiful video that was produced around, and also just a flag for participants here as well. There is a link at the bottom of that in which, if people want to show practical material solidarity with her journey, and her gift in terms of her voice, that there's ways in which people can engage with that as well. So if you just scroll down after the video to that link at the end, that would be brilliant. So thank you. And Prue, if you have anything. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I do. I wish we had so much more time to talk, because it's just been amazing hearing everybody, and very much resonates. So much of what everyone says very much resonates. I guess a couple of things that I just were feeling and I wanted to add, and I know that it's thing that we talked about. It's very much kind of following up from what Alia was saying about the how, and I think that something that we were trying to achieve through the summit was to create a system of advocacy within the network, if you want to call it that, this wider network that we're part of, to avoid these conversations that we're having now just being for those in the know or for those in the echo chamber. That obviously everybody in this space right now has an awareness of the necessity of, transitioning things into a space that we're talking about, this aspirational space where we have these practices sewn into the web of our network, and they're as important as every other part of operational stuff that we do. But I personally, and I'm sure many of you have experienced the same, if you try to bring this as a topic, if you try to kind of influence or fasciculate, is a word that I like to use, changes within the network. The summit was a space where we intentionally seek to do that, along with Darren, along with Indigo Volunteers. Human Hive were our partners. Indigo Volunteers also were our brilliant partners. But we did feel just a real kind of slight resistance, particularly from funding bodies, grassroots funding bodies, and from organisations which sit as umbrellas over multiple groups doing the work. There was a real resistance to making this a priority. And so I would love for us to continue these conversations, along with applying resources, along with us looking at the different modalities that we're all using, because we're obviously all doing this work in different ways, is to try to come together and perhaps continue these conversations, particularly now in the circumstances that we're in right now, with the change in direction of one of the major funders of the grassroots network, and the lack of the funding that's being removed from the work that a lot of people are doing, that it's going to throw a lot of precarity into the grassroots network. And I'm hearing from a lot of people that they're already very fearful, they're suffering, they're struggling, they are having to extract themselves from projects with no resources to do that. And I'm just wondering if there's a space where we could continue some of these conversations. If anybody's keen to be part of a discussion, we're happy to host it under the summit as an umbrella, just to hold space. And then I invite you all to come and bring your expertise, your ideas, your experiences. That's just an open invitation. I don't have anything else to add other than thank you so much for letting me be part of this conversation. But yeah, if anybody's interested in that, then reach out and get in touch, because there's already conversations happening, particularly around how do we resource and fund it, because it's talking about it is great. But we know that in order to have these personnel who are trained and that can do all the amazing things that Gabriella, you suggested, we do need to have this as a priority financially as well. And we need to learn from those with the experience. I mean, Comhlámh are amazing. I was unaware of your work for about 3 years of doing my the work that I was doing, even though my partner, my live-in partner, is Irish and knows your work very well. We just haven't sort of had those conversations. So I think that there's a lot of work been done over the years out there in different areas of activism. And, you know, if we're very myopic and isolated in our approaches, you know, the work that we're doing with people on the move, just like Pat said, is part of a bigger systemic thing. It's just one component of all these other forms of activism and advocacy and development work and humanitarian work. So we could perhaps cross-pollinate better.
I think that's a lovely invitation to close the panel on, in terms of, yeah, that need for cross-pollination and collective work, collective care, ecologies of care, and self-resourcing. So I want to thank you all so much, to Gabriella, Alia, Maddie, Prue, Brendan, Pat, Paula, Elena, Donna in her absence. It's been such a pleasure to share space with you. And we're all really looking forward to continuing these conversations and this sort of praxis vis-a-vis the work. So thank you, I think, in very busy context, for you all really privileging us and honoring us with your wisdom, your insights, your reflections, and your gesturing towards future steps in this collective journey. So thank you, and we'll definitely be in touch with people soon, and everybody who's attended. I was just chatting with Mark, our coordinator at Comhlámh. He'll be in touch with folks in early the new year, once we finish the design process of some of the resources. And yeah, just with signposts for both what Prue mentioned in terms of continuing this conversation, and obviously, Gabriella, we'd love to be part of whatever process continues as well in Greece. So thank you very much. Be well, stay well, have lovely holidays. Hopefully it's time for pause and rest and reflection. And thank you particularly to Elena. We're all going to really carry the spirit of your song with us. Yay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
And Paula.
Bye, thank you.
Everyone, bye.